I stood in front of the farmhouse on a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, holding a single piece of paper from the county clerk's office in Hancock County, Ohio. The paper said I owned 163 acres, a house, two barns, and a machine shed. What it didn't say was that I had no keys to any of it. The auction had been strange from the start. Estate sale, no heirs, property sold as is. I was the only bidder. $1. The auctioneer looked at me like I'd stolen something, but the gavel came down and I signed. When I asked about keys, he said the executor never provided any. Good luck, he said, and that was that. The house was a two-story clapboard, white paint peeling in long strips, built sometime in the 20s by the look of the foundation stones. Every door was locked, every window latched from the inside. I walked the perimeter twice, checking. The barns were the same, padlocked, rusted but holding. The machine shed had a chain looped through the handles thick as my wrist. I was 64 years old. I'd farmed my whole life on land my father left me, 40 miles south in Wyandotte County. But that land was gone now, sold off piece by piece to cover what the hospital couldn't after my wife Ellen passed in '85. I had a pickup, $1,200, and this piece of paper that said I owned a farm I couldn't get into. I was about to head back to the truck when I noticed the cellar door. It was set into the ground on the east side of the house. Wooden frame, two angled doors that should have been locked like everything else. But the left door was open, not broken, not forced. Just open, resting against the frame like someone had left it that way on purpose. I stood there looking at it for a long time. The wind was coming across the fields, cold and steady, and I could smell old wood and damp earth rising up from that opening. There was no reason for it to be open, no reason at all. I knelt down, pulled the door back the rest of the way, and looked into the dark. There were stone steps going down, maybe 8 or 9 of them, steep and narrow. I could see the first 3 in the daylight, then nothing but black. I didn't have a flashlight. Hadn't thought to bring one. But I had a Bic lighter in my jacket pocket, the kind you buy at the gas station for $1, and I flicked it on and started down. The air changed halfway down the steps. It got colder, thicker, like stepping into a walk-in cooler that hadn't been opened in years. The flame bent sideways in the draft, and I had to cup my hand around it to keep it lit. At the bottom, the floor was packed dirt, smooth and hard, and the ceiling was low enough that I had to duck my head under the floor joists. The smell was stronger down there. Earth, yes, but also something else. Old paper. Rust. Kerosene, maybe, from a lamp that hadn't burned in decades. I moved the lighter around slowly, letting my eyes adjust. The cellar wasn't big, maybe 12 feet by 15. There were shelves along the far wall, rough-cut lumber nailed between the studs, and on those shelves were mason jars, dozens of them, covered in dust so thick you couldn't see what was inside. A few had cracked and leaked whatever they'd held, leaving dark stains on the wood. In the corner there was a workbench, or what was left of one. The top was warped and split, and there were tools scattered across it. A claw hammer with a loose head, a handsaw with most of its teeth gone, a coffee can full of nails that had rusted into a single solid mass. But what stopped me was the trunk. It was sitting against the north wall, directly under the floor of what I guessed was the kitchen. A steamer trunk, the old kind with leather straps and brass corners, the kind people used to take on trains before anyone flew anywhere. It was maybe 3 feet long, 2 feet deep. Dark wood with metal banding around the edges. The leather was cracked and peeling, and one of the straps had rotted through completely. But the trunk itself looked solid, and it wasn't locked. I knelt down in front of it, set the lighter on the dirt beside me, and lifted the lid. The smell hit me first. Old paper, mildew, something faintly sweet like dried flowers left too long in a drawer. Inside were layers. On top, folded clothes, a woman's dress, pale blue cotton with small white buttons down the front, the kind my mother used to wear to church in the 50s. Beneath that, a man's work shirt, heavy flannel, red and black plaid, the cuffs stained dark with what might have been oil or blood, or just decades of honest dirt. I lifted them out carefully and set them on the workbench. Under the clothes were papers. A lot of papers. Some were loose, some were bundled with twine that crumbled when I touched it. I picked up the first bundle and held it close to the lighter. Receipts. Feed store receipts from 1947, 1948, 1949. Grain elevator tickets. A bill of sale for a Farmall H tractor, dated June 12, 1951. Paid in full, $1,850. A handwritten ledger, the kind with marbled covers and ruled columns, every line filled in with careful pencil. Dates, expenses, income, weather notes. March 3rd, planted north 40, oats, wind southwest, clear. April 18th, calf-born heifer, good weight. May 2, fence down, east pasture, fixed. I flipped through it slowly. The handwriting was steady, patient, the kind that came from a man who had time and saw no reason to rush. The entries ran from 1946 to 1953, then stopped. Just stopped. Mid-season. No explanation. The last entry was July 9th, 1953. Hay in, 127 bales, hot. And then nothing. I set the ledger aside and dug deeper. At the very bottom of the trunk, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that was still faintly supple, was an envelope. It was addressed in the same careful hand, but there was no stamp, no postmark, just a name written across the front in fading ink. To whoever finds this. I sat back on my heels and stared at it for a long moment. The cellar was silent except for the faint creak of the house settling above me. I could feel my heart beating in my chest, slow and heavy. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The handwriting was the same as the ledger, careful, deliberate, each letter formed like it mattered. It was dated August 2nd, 1953, 3 weeks after the last entry in the ledger. The letter began without preamble. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and this place has passed to someone else. I hope it is someone who will see it for what it is. I read slowly, my eyes adjusting to the slant of the script in the dim light. The man's name was Samuel Garrett. He had bought the farm in 1946, just after the war, with money he had saved working in a munitions plant in Ohio. He had no family left. His wife had died in childbirth in 1944, the baby with her, and he had come here to start over. He worked the land alone for 7 years, grew corn and hay, kept a few hogs, fixed what broke, and wrote it all down in that ledger because, he said, a man should know what he's done with his time. Then, in the summer of 1953, he got sick. He didn't say what it was, just that the doctor in town told him he had maybe a month, maybe 2. He spent those weeks putting the farm in order. He drained the equipment, greased the fittings, stacked the tools, locked the sheds. He wrote the letter and placed it in the trunk with the ledger and the deed. And then, he wrote, he walked out to the back 40 and sat under the oak tree by the fence line, and he waited. The letter ended with a single line. This place gave me peace when I had none. I hope it does the same for you. I folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. My hands were shaking just slightly. I sat there in the cellar for a long time, the envelope resting on my knee, the smell of old wood and earth all around me. Samuel Garrett had died alone on this farm, and no one had come. The place had been locked up, left to the county, sold off for $1 70 years later to a man who didn't even know his name. Until now. I stood up slowly, my knees stiff from sitting on that cold stone floor. The envelope went into my jacket pocket, and I climbed back up the cellar stairs into the kitchen. The light through the windows had shifted. It was past noon now, maybe 1 o'clock. I walked through the house again, but this time it felt different. The dust, the peeling wallpaper, the broken chair by the window. It wasn't abandonment anymore. It was waiting. I went outside and walked the property line, following the fence posts Samuel had mentioned. Most of them were rotted through, leaning at angles, but every 100 feet or so there was one that stood straight, replaced, I figured, in the years before he died. The back 40 sloped down toward a dry creek bed, and at the far edge, right where the fence turned east, there was an oak tree. Massive. Had to be 150 years old, maybe more. The trunk was 4 feet across, bark thick and furrowed, branches spreading out like a roof. Beneath it, the ground was bare except for a few tufts of grass and a scattering of acorns from last fall. I stood there under that tree for a while, looking back toward the house. From here, you could see the whole farm. The barn, the sheds, the house with its sagging porch, the fields stretching out flat and empty under the sky. Samuel Garrett had sat here. He had looked at this same view. And then he had died, and no one had known. I thought about the ledger. 43 years of entries. Corn planted, corn harvested, fence mended, roof patched, tractor repaired. Every year, the same rhythm, the same work, the same quiet persistence. And at the end of it, nothing but a letter in a trunk and a farm sold for $1 to a stranger. But that wasn't quite right, was it? Because I was here now. I had the letter. I knew his name. And I had 40 acres of land that no one else had wanted, but that he had loved enough to leave behind with instructions. I walked back to the house and stood on the porch, looking out at the barn. The padlock was still hanging open on the hasp. I hadn't gone inside yet. I'd been putting it off, I realized. Some part of me afraid of what I might find, or what I might not find. I pulled the door open and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Old hay, motor oil, dust that had been settling for decades. The light came in through gaps in the siding, thin beams cutting through the dark, and I could see the shape of something large in the center of the barn, covered with a canvas tarp that had gone stiff with age. I walked over to it slowly, my boots loud on the concrete floor. The tarp was tied down with rope, knotted tight, and I had to work at it for a few minutes before I could pull it free. When I did, I just stood there. It was a tractor, a 1952 John Deere Model 60. Green paint faded to almost gray in places, but the lines were clean, the tires still holding air. I walked around it once, then twice. No rust on the frame. The seat was cracked but intact. The steering wheel was wrapped in electrical tape, probably from the last time someone had driven it. I climbed up and sat down, and the seat gave under my weight with a creak that sounded like it had been waiting 40 years to make that noise again. The key was in the ignition. I turned it halfway, not expecting anything, and the fuel gauge needle twitched. I looked down at the floorboard and saw a toolbox, metal, painted red, with E.H. stenciled on the lid in white. I opened it. Inside were wrenches, a socket set, a can of penetrating oil, and a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it. It was a maintenance log, handwritten, dated from 1979 to 1983. Oil changes, spark plugs, carburetor rebuild. The last entry was March 14th, 1983. Drained fuel, greased all fittings, ready for storage. He'd put it to bed like you tuck in a child. I sat there for a long time, holding that paper, looking at the dashboard, at the throttle lever, at the clutch pedal worn smooth from use. This wasn't just a tractor. This was the thing he'd used to work the land for 30 years. This was what he'd trusted when the corn needed planting and the ground was hard. And he'd left it here, preserved, waiting. I stepped out of the cab and walked around the tractor slowly, running my hand along the fender, the hood, the exhaust stack. The paint was dull but intact. The tires were flat, but the sidewalls hadn't cracked. I crouched down and looked at the oil pan. No leaks. I checked the radiator hoses, stiff but not split. I pulled the dipstick. The oil was black as tar, but it was there. I unscrewed the radiator cap and shined my flashlight down into the tank. Dry. He drained it, just like the log said. I went back to the toolbox and pulled out the can of penetrating oil. I sprayed every bolt I could reach. The manifold, the injector lines, the governor linkage. I worked the throttle lever back and forth until it moved freely. I pulled the air cleaner off and looked down into the intake. Clean. No rust, no dirt, no mouse nests. He'd sealed it before he left. I found a 5-gallon jerry can in the corner of the barn, half full of diesel. I didn't know how old it was, but I poured it into the tank anyway. I found a garden hose coiled on a nail and filled the radiator from the hand pump outside. The water was cold and clear. I reconnected the battery cables I'd pulled earlier and tightened them down. Then I climbed back into the seat. I turned the key to the on position. The fuel gauge needle didn't move. I pushed the throttle forward halfway and pulled the choke all the way out. My hand was shaking a little. I turned the key. The starter groaned. Slow, heavy. The engine turned over once, twice, 3 times, then stopped. I waited 10 seconds and tried again. This time it turned 4 times before it caught, coughed, and died. I could smell diesel now. I pushed the choke in halfway and turned the key a 3rd time. The engine fired. 1 cylinder, then 2, then all 4. Black smoke poured out of the exhaust stack, thick and oily, and the whole machine shook like it was waking up from a long sleep. I eased the choke and the rest of the way and let it idle. The sound was rough at first, uneven, but after 30 seconds it smoothed out into a low, steady rumble that I could feel through the seat, through the floor, through my boots. I sat there with both hands on the wheel, listening to it run. And I thought about Elias Harmon sitting in this same seat 43 years ago, writing that last line in his log. I let it run for 5 minutes, watching the temperature gauge climb slowly from cold to the first mark. The oil pressure held steady at 40 pounds. No knocking, no grinding, no steam from anywhere it shouldn't be. I pressed the clutch and moved the shift lever into first gear. It went in smooth. I eased the clutch out and the tractor rolled forward 6 feet before I pushed it back in and hit the brake. Everything worked. I shifted into reverse, backed up to where I'd started, then pulled it forward again and turned the wheel. The front tires pivoted without binding. I shut it down, pulled the key, and sat there in the silence that followed, staring at the instrument panel. 43 years. Elias Harmon had parked this machine in August of 1981, written 4 words in a notebook, locked the barn, and walked away. And now, in May of 2024, it had started on the 3rd try with nothing but fresh fuel, a charged battery, and 10 minutes of my time. I thought about all the things that should have gone wrong. Seized pistons, rusted valves, rotted hoses, mice in the air filter, water in the oil. Any one of those would have been enough to turn this tractor into scrap. But none of them had happened. Elias had done something right. He drained the coolant, sealed the intake, greased every fitting and left it clean. He'd prepared it like a man who believed someone would need it again someday. I climbed down and walked around the tractor one more time, running my hand along the fender, checking the tires, looking under the frame. There was surface rust on the exhaust manifold and some dirt caked in the wheel wells, but the bones were solid. This wasn't a museum piece. This was a tool, and it still worked. I thought about the county assessor's letter sitting on the kitchen table back home. The one that said I owed $1,847 in back taxes by June 15th. Or they'd start foreclosure proceedings on my own place. I thought about the $300 in my checking account and the fact that my own tractor, a 1998 Ford with a blown head gasket, had been sitting in my shed for 2 months because I couldn't afford the repair. And I thought about the fact that I now owned a working 1978 International Harvester 1086 that I'd paid $1 for. I stood there in that barn for another 20 minutes just thinking. The math was simple enough. A working 1086 in decent shape was worth anywhere from $8,000 to $12,000, depending on who was buying and how bad they needed it. Even if I sold it quick, took the first offer, I could clear my tax bill, fix my own tractor, and still have money left over. That was the smart play, the safe play. But something about it didn't sit right. I walked back to the house, climbed those porch steps again, and sat down on the top one. The sun was starting to drop behind the tree line to the west, throwing long shadows across the yard. I could hear a cardinal somewhere in the lilac bushes by the fence, and the wind was picking up just enough to make the barn door creak on its hinges. I pulled out my phone and called my daughter, Sarah. She lives in Columbus now, works for an insurance company, married to a man who wears a tie to work every day. Good people. But they don't understand the land. She picked up on the third ring. Dad, everything okay? I'm fine, I said. I'm out at that farm I bought, the one I told you about. There was a pause. The $1 farm? Dad, you didn't actually go through with that, did you? I did. Another pause. Longer this time. Okay, what's it like? I told her about the house, the barn, the tractor. I told her about the keys and the locked doors and the fact that I still didn't know what was in most of the rooms. I told her about the tax bill waiting for me back home and the decision I was trying to make. So sell the tractor, she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. You said it yourself. It's worth 10 times what you need. Problem solved. Yeah, I said. That's what I keep telling myself. But I keep thinking about why he left it here. Why he didn't sell it himself when he needed the money. Why he locked up the whole place except for that one barn door. Dad, he was 93 years old. Maybe he just forgot. Maybe, I said. Or maybe he left it open on purpose. I stayed on the phone with Sarah for another 20 minutes, talking about nothing in particular. Her job, the weather back home, whether I'd remembered to pay the electric bill before I left. When we hung up, the house felt quieter than it had before. I sat there in the kitchen with my coffee going cold, looking at the locked doors down the hallway, and I realized something. I'd been treating this place like a puzzle I needed to solve before I could leave, like if I could just find the right keys, open the right doors, figure out what Thomas Whitmore had been thinking. Then I'd know what to do. But maybe that wasn't the point at all. I got up and walked back out to the barn. The farmall was still sitting there in the afternoon light, red paint glowing like it had been waiting all along. I climbed up into the seat again, ran my hand over the steering wheel, felt the worn places where his hands had been. 43 years he'd owned this machine. 43 years of springs and summers, of planting and harvest, of breakdowns and repairs. And in all that time, he'd never sold it. Not when land prices dropped in the 80s. Not when his wife died. Not when he was 90 years old and living alone in a house with half the doors locked. I thought about what Sarah had said, that maybe he'd just forgot to lock the barn. But the more I sat there, the more I didn't believe it. Everything else about this place was deliberate. The will, the dollar, the way he'd kept the tractor running all those years. A man doesn't do all that and then forget to lock the one door that matters. He left it open because he wanted someone to find it, not the county, not some estate sale company. Someone like me, someone who'd actually come out here, walk through the empty rooms, sit in the kitchen and try to understand what he'd been holding on to all this time. I climbed down from the tractor and stood there looking at it for a long moment. Then I walked back to the house, past the locked doors, and out to the truck. I had Thomas Whitmore's phone number. The lawyer had given it to me with the deed. It was disconnected now, of course. But there was something else in that envelope, something I hadn't paid much attention to before. A handwritten note. Just 3 lines in pencil on the back of a receipt from Harlan's feed, and dated April 1987. It said, "If you're reading this, you found the tractor. The rest is in the cellar, under the 3rd step from the bottom. Don't let them take it." No signature. But the handwriting matched the logbook. I went back inside. The cellar door was in the kitchen next to the pantry. It opened with a groan. Old hinges, no lock. The stairs were wood, steep, and they creaked under my weight. I counted them as I went down. 1, 2, 3. The 3rd step from the bottom was wider than the others, and when I knelt down and ran my hand along the edge, I felt it. A seam. The riser wasn't nailed in. It lifted out. Behind it was a metal box, not big. Maybe 10 inches by 12. It was wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine that had gone brittle with age. I carried it up into the light and set it on the kitchen table. My hands were shaking a little as I untied the knot. Inside the oilcloth was a fireproof document box, the kind you'd buy at an office supply store in the 70s. The latch was stiff, but it opened. The first thing I saw was a stack of envelopes, all addressed to Thomas Whitmore, all from the same sender, Midwest Agricultural Credit Union. I opened the top one. It was dated March 2003, a foreclosure notice, final warning. The farm was going to auction unless he paid $47,000 by the end of the month. The next envelope was from April, another notice, then May, then nothing. No more letters. Just a single sheet of paper, handwritten, dated May 18, 2003. It said, "Paid in full, cash. They don't get to win this time." Underneath the letters was a ledger, not the tractor logbook. This one was older, leather-bound, with his father's name embossed on the cover, Robert J. Whitmore. I opened it. The entries went back to 1948. Every dollar earned, every dollar spent, every loan taken, every payment made. And on the last page, in Thomas's handwriting, a single line, "What my father built, I will not lose." I sat there on that cellar floor for a long time, holding that ledger. The kerosene lamp flickered against the stone walls, and I could hear the wind picking up outside, rattling the barn doors the way it always did when a storm was coming in from the west. Thomas Whitmore had saved this place with cash he'd hidden for 20 years. He'd watched the banks circle, watched the neighbors sell out one by one, and when they came for him, He walked into that credit union with $47,000 in a canvas bag and paid them off in full. Then he locked the door to this cellar and never opened it again. He didn't need to. The fight was over. I climbed back up those stairs, pulled the door shut behind me, and walked out into the yard. The sun was setting over the back 40, turning the sky the color of rust. I looked at the barn, the machine shed, the fence line running north toward the county road. It wasn't much. 44 acres, a house that needed work, equipment that hadn't run in 15 years. But it was paid for, free, and clear. And that meant something. I spent the next 6 months bringing it back. I got the farm all running. Took me 3 weeks in a new carburetor, but she fired up on a Tuesday morning in late September, and I drove her out to the south field just to feel the weight of her under me. I patched the barn roof, replaced the rotted boards on the porch, cleared the fence line. I didn't sell a single thing, not the tools, not the tractor, not 1 acre of that land. By spring, I had corn in the ground. People ask me sometimes why I bought that place. $1 for a farm with no keys, no way in, no guarantees. I tell them the truth. I bought it because Thomas Whitmore spent his whole life making sure it would still be there when someone like me came along. Someone who understood that what matters isn't how much you have. It's whether you can hold on to it when the wind turns cold and the bills come due. If you've got something worth keeping, a piece of ground, an old machine, a promise you made to yourself, don't let them take it. And if this story meant something to you, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments, what's the one thing you're holding on to, no matter what?